Yeah. Bomb. Should be going live any moment now. Good evening. Yes, we're live. And welcome. And I'm Chris, and I'll be speaking to Ben tonight. And we're going to be talking about the Tavistock. Was it Institute or Centre? I can't remember.
Tavistock Institute.
Institute. Now, I believe that, I've done quite a bit of research into the Frankfurt School, and I believe they are of a similar ilk. But actually, Ben, well, go ahead. This is, people don't realise these institutes are around, and they're actually dictating our lives without the majority of people really knowing it.
Yeah, it's one of these organisations that seems to be everywhere, but very few people have heard of it. It seems to be enormously influential and enormously powerful, quite frankly. Now, if you go to the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, that's a very Orwellian phrase in itself. And you'll find that it was actually established in 1947 as an institute to apply social sciences to contemporary issues and problems. It's engaged with evaluation and action research, organisational development and change consultancy, executive coaching and professional development, all in the service of supporting sustainable change and ongoing learning. It's dedicated to the study of human relations for the purpose of bettering working life conditions for all humans within their organisations, communities and broader society, and the influence of the environment in all aspects of formation of the development of human character or capacity to conduct research and provide opportunities for learning through experience for the purpose. The public, and it publishes, it goes on like that. Now, I read through its mission statement, and by the time I finished that, I did not understand any more about what it's about than when I started.
Well, as I said earlier, don't want to cut across you, but I knew somebody that went to see a Tony Blair speech before he became Prime Minister, and she said that everybody's elated. Oh yeah, fantastic! And when they came out, it was a bit like a Chinese meal. He hasn't really said anything. It was just sort of hype. And you go and have a Chinese meal, you're full up, and about half hour later, I'm hungry. And that seems to be the thing nowadays. It's sort of hype, but I think behind that hype, there's something very sinister.
Yeah, when you read things like this, when you read what you just heard, and again Blair's speeches, they're actually using language not to inform, but to obfuscate. They're using language to deceive and to cover up. They're saying an awful lot. There's an awful lot here. There's an awful lot written here, and it's pretty clear that it's designed to put people off. People just read through it, and the complexity of it and the meaninglessness of it just puts people off.
Yeah.
So really, people don't really look any further into what the thing is about. But it's actually a psychological think tank. It develops out the Tavistock Clinic, which was very active during World War II. And indeed, the first unit, which eventually became the Tavistock Institute, was a part of British Army psychiatry. And once it was founded, it's an independent organisation, but it actually works alongside all kinds of other. It's basically contracted to various governments, corporations of all kinds, including especially the National Health Service. It was awarded a significant grant from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Warning lights.
And it has worked through various institutions such as Unilever, Shell, Oil, Bayer, the National Coal Board, and various other. It does things such as customer service, things like that. And now it comes out of the Freudian school of psychoanalysis. That's its main. Its main kind of thrust is to apply Freudian psychological warfare techniques to society in general. And this actually means that it's being used to give people who employ it an awful lot of power.
Yeah. Because
it's designed to take this organisation and increase its abilities, increase its scope and its punch through the ability to control the minds of the people it deals with, to manipulate their thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
What Edward Albanese called the manufacturing of consent. It's very often called things such as public relations. Public relations is probably the most common sort of euphemism that's used for this sort of thing, although public relations is not necessarily about mind control, but it very often is.
It's propaganda, isn't it?
Yeah, propaganda is another word for it, and it's been involved in things such as the music industry. It's worked with people such as Theodore Adorno, who's very interested in music and how it affected people. He was another psychological warfare expert. He worked with the Frankfurt School as well, which is again a similar organisation. You may have heard of Common Purpose.
Oh yes.
It's another. It's Common Purpose is very similar. It's a fifth column psychological warfare outfit, which is basically been inserted into our lives to change the way we think and feel. And in order to do that, it's actually quite frightening how easy it is to do that if you have a few certain basic bit of training about how the human mind works. So there's certain people who demonstrate this, and they do it for entertainment purposes. It's all perfectly harmless, but it always gives me a bit of a chill. One of them's Darren Brown, the stage mentalist. And he's got nothing to do with the Tavistock Institute, don't worry. But he demonstrates how easy it is to manipulate other people through their minds simply by using certain techniques. Indeed, Darren Brown actually targeted a friend of mine, actually, a guy on Black. He was on Blackpool Pier in one of his programs, and he comes up to a friend of mine, a chap called, he's a guy who goes to the Pro Conference. His name's escaping me, as awful as it is. Dexter. Mm-hmm. And he says, could you hand me your wallet, please, and your front door keys and things like that? And this guy just does it. And Dex is halfway down the pier, he looks over his shoulder. And he said, what did I do that for? And Dex told me about this, and he said it scared him. It scared him how this happened.
It's just terrifying.
That's done for show. Darren gave him the keys and wallet back afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
But Dex, I think, told me about this and said, I didn't realise what I was doing. I just did it without thinking.
Well, look at kamikaze pilots. Now, we used to believe that Japanese kamikaze pilots were absolute fanatics, etc., etc. Well, yeah, many of them were, but there was a number of them that were actually pushed into it and didn't want to do it, and they had aircraft watching them to make sure they did do it, did go and commit suicide. And let's face it, today, if they wanted kamikaze pilots, they wouldn't call them kamikaze pilots. They would be, they'd probably go to a PR agency in London, and they'd say something like community enlightenment officers or something like that. And they would advertise saying, the health benefits of flying with an open cockpit, free flight training, free burial expenses, and in very small writing, there's a 99.9% chance you won't come back. And I could guarantee if they got PR onto it to get kamikaze pilots, there'll be a queue wrapping around the corner. People say, oh yeah, I want to be an enlightenment officer. It's great, yeah. And the government would send out rumours that, oh yeah, they come back from the mission, when they don't. And they'd have people saying, oh yes, I know someone's come back 3 times from a mission, when they haven't. And I've noticed that there's a rumour mill that the government actually push out. I mean, have you noticed that, Ben?
Yeah. Oh, there's all kinds of stories like this come out and about, and there's all kinds of ways and means they use. Now, there's a very, very good documentary called The Century of the Self. It's a documentary by Adam Curtis. He did another one called The Trap, which is just as good, actually. But they're kind of like 2 parts of the same documentary, really. They talk about how this was done, and they say some amazing things. For example, before 1920, women never smoked. This was really quite surprised me when I first heard about it, but it's true. It was a complete masculine thing. Very few women smoked before 1920. Those that did were usually lesbians. It was considered part of the sort of lesbian culture. Really, but apart from that, really it was very, very unladylike to smoke. Now, Bronfman's, the tobacco industry, I think they bought out by Marlboro or one of these other big Bed's and Hedges or something. But they were the big tobacco giants at the time. They said, that we want to start selling these things to women too. We need to find a way of getting women to smoke. It doesn't matter how many times you advertise it to women saying how wonderful cigarettes are, how great they are. Women just aren't buying them because it's not culturally and socially acceptable for women to smoke. So what they did was they employed a guy called Edward Albanese, who I think mentioned his name already. He's the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the guy who's really behind the whole thing. And Benet said, yes, I'll tell you what, I'll get women to smoke before you know it. And so he had in the, I think it was called the New York, I forgot what it was, it's in New York City, USA. They had a massive carnival. It was quite a regular thing. And they had floats from the carnival with various displays on them. And one of them, Bronfman's actually had a float. He had a float on there. And there were lots of women on the float, pretty girls, nice looking. The kind of women other women will admire, the kind of women men will find attractive. And at given moments, these women suddenly reached, they didn't have pockets or handbags, they had like fishnet stockings, it was all very racy, very burlesque kind of thing. And they had the cigarettes tucked into the fishnet stockings and they pulled them out and started smoking. And everyone in the crowd went, oh my God, it's shocking. And it got a lot of media attention. And there were all kinds of slogans associated with this action, they called it, things such as torches of freedom and things like that. And indeed, this was the time when first wave feminism was in full swing. And Benet very cleverly associated smoking with first wave feminism. The suffragettes and organisations like that were very, very powerful at the time. And before you know it, women were smoking all over the place. And so today, proportionally, head to head, women outnumber male smokers.
I didn't know that. I know a lot of young girls are smoking now, and I didn't know
my
that.
daughter does. I'd rather she didn't, but she's an adult. I can't tell her what to do.
Yes.
But isn't that amazing? An entire culture was turned on its head by one very clever man who knew a little bit about how we tick up here, and he used it to his advantage and the advantage of his employer, Bronfman. So Bronfman suddenly had a huge number of additional customers.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, the other one is, you look at the First World War and people falling over themselves to volunteer to go to the front. And it was an incredible advertising hype because most people don't realise that although World War I started in 1914, 20 years beforehand, the press had a lot of anti-German propaganda. And by the time 1914 came, people were chomping at the bit. And there hadn't been there had been wars in Europe, yes, but not one that Britain had been involved in since, I think, Waterloo. And people thought, oh, fantastic, and they said, quickly, volunteer because it'll be over by Christmas and you're going to miss it. And it's really exciting, get the King's shilling and, whoa, fantastic. And when you look at it, it was an incredible advertising hype. And Edward Bernays, the chap you mentioned, was actually head of propaganda for the Americans in World War I.
I'm not at all surprised, And it's obvious that they use the same techniques in Britain because, firstly, it's the kind of war that no one had ever seen before. No one knew how bad it was really going to be, and there'd never been a war like that. So everyone was still full of. To be honest, there was always that kind of. We mentioned 20 years of propaganda. 20 years. Everyone's had that idea of the British Empire being a force for good, and that Britain was wonderful, and Britain could do no wrong, and that the fighting men of Britain were always fighting for a noble cause. They had soldiers portrayed as like the knights, the noble knights of old, and then what they did was, there was a few guys who could see through it, and for various reasons they refused to take part, and they did something very clever. They got these women, very attractive women, rather like the ones on the floats in New York, the cigarettes, and they got them to go to these guys and hand white feathers to them. And they knew this was psychological bullying. They knew exactly where to hit and where it hurts in the sexual market value. This is it's a psychological thing, and again that's the Tavistock Institute founded that, but it's the kind of thing they would do. It's exactly the methods they use.
Well, look at the Second World War. There's a friend of mine, his father was in the Merchant Navy, and he was coming across on the Atlantic convoys, braving, really, going through it. And because he had civilian clothes on, he was often abused. And this poor chap, he was in D-Day. He'd been on the Atlantic convoys, he'd been on the Russian convoys, he'd certainly seen action, but because of that civilian clothing, they thought, oh, dodging it, oh, yeah, oh, not, not doing your bit. And all. This poor chap, he really had to put up with it. And it's all that sort of propaganda and that. But what have you know? Sorry.
I was just say it's very difficult to break through that because it's all just it's designed to be anti-intellectual. It's designed to push people away from rationality into spontaneous emotional decisions. And judgments. For example, the white feathering of guys. That was all nonsense because a lot of those guys actually went and worked in the medical corps and they went out into no man's land and they trod around mines and things like that. And so they were very brave, but they were. That doesn't. It's like you say this guy in the merchant navy because he was a merchant sailor. He was down on, but you could explain to the person who was brainwashed. Well, that's not fair, but they won't. Their brain has been designed not to respond to logical arguments. I'll give you another good example. This is from World War One. Now, the British Expeditionary Force was where basically Britain landed on in Europe and basically sent massive numbers of troops to Europe, which essentially started the war. And as you say, a lot of guys volunteered. Now, some of them were driven on by the white feathering and the 20 years of German propaganda. But there was one particular news story that really, really spurred on the desire to join the army and fight. All the major British newspapers reported this, that when the Kaiser's army invaded what's now eastern Belgium, and they marched into the city of Liège. And what the newspapers reported happened was when the evil Germans, the guys with the subject of propaganda, as soon as they got into Liège, they took the babies out of the mother's arms. Young babies were taken from their mother's arms, and they impaled them on bayonets, and on the big spike on top of their helmets, which they used to have. And they impaled them on the top of the dead bodies of the babies, killed them, put them on and they marched around the town on parade with these dead children, dead young infants, on their weapons and on their helmets, with blood dripping down their helmets. And the newspaper even reported the Germans licked their lips as the blood dripped over their face. Now, this story was a complete fabrication. It never happened. Yeah. Yet it was reported as fact by the media to everyone in the country. And people believed it. And that's a lot of the guys who got on the first ship that were and start the war that ended all wars, which went on for another 4.5 years, 18 million dead, chemical weapons, machine gun fire, things like that. They were thinking, we've got to go and get those baby killers. Yeah, incredible.
Well, it's a bit like the Iraq war with the incubators. The Iraqi soldiers throwing the incubators out of the hospital and killing babies.
Just throwing the babies.
That was in what, 1990, 1991?
This was told by a young girl who apparently she witnessed this, apparently. But this young girl was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador.
That's right, yeah.
She was also a drama student. She'd been studying drama at college, and you can see why they selected her to do it.
Well,
again, complete fabrication.
Well, it's like sorry, carry on. Sorry.
I was going to say by the time people realised it wasn't true, it was too late. It'd done its job.
Well, that's right. I mean, my granddad, I remember him saying, "Well, you know that the Germans, after the First World War, they were burning up bodies in the Black Forest to get the fat from the body. That's complete fabrication. It never happened."
They burn the bodies, but they burn them to prevent disease. It's a way of preventing disease.
Yeah, but he was told in the newspapers that they needed the lard, they needed the fat. What for? I don't know, but they needed the fat, and there's all these awful things that these Germans had done. And really, when you look at the Second World War, the strange thing about the Second World War is Hitler was the darling of the press until about a year before 1939. I mean, he was Man of the Year, Time Man of the Year, and
he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1933.
That's right, and also he was in Homes and Gardens magazine in 1938. And my father used to read the newspapers to his blind father, and he said he couldn't believe it, that overnight it was like a sort of something had come down, and he was a darling of the press, and the next minute he was an absolute evil monster. And that happened overnight. He went from an angel to a monster over. It's incredible.
Oceania is no longer at war with Eurasia. Eurasia are our allies. Oceania is at war with East Asia. That's a line from 1984, the book, which explains how these same individuals can just flip over and become the opposite of what they were before. And it wouldn't be possible without psychological warfare. It really wouldn't. It wouldn't be possible without the Tavistock Institute and similar institutions. It really wouldn't.
But how you see this reacting today? Because I've noticed, I mean, one thing, when I was a kid, it's probably the same for you. If you're a boy, don't do that, you're a sissy. And kids used to shout, sissy, you know, if you did something that might have looked a bit effeminate, or you cried if someone kicked your knee or something. And you were terrified of being labelled a sissy. Now, if somebody doesn't like what you're saying, you're a racist or a Nazi or something like that. Same context. It's to stop. It's to put you into a group so you don't say any more, to sort of shut you up.
It's a similar trick. It's a very, very similar trick, and it works, unfortunately. The thing of these tricks is they will keep on working. The baby incubator story, as I said, we both thought of the same thing at the same time. Is really exactly the same as the Liège baby story. They were used decades. They were used about 80 years apart. But they did the trick. Unfortunately, they both worked. These tricks will keep on working for as long as people keep believing them. When they stop working, they'll stop using them. It's that simple. Which means, so you have to keep hold of rationality at all times, and remember, instead of thinking to yourself, well, what's easy, what's convenient for me at this point, think, oh, is it real? Is it true? And also, is it fair? Is that person really a racist, or is it just cool to call him that? Things like that. And you may have to go against everyone and lots of other people around you. It's very, very difficult to do that because we are a social creature, we're a social animal, and we have a tendency to go along to get along. And that's one of the things that the Tavistock Institute exploits.
Oh, that's right. I mean, I was in a previous life. I was freelance in architecture, and I worked in loads of offices. And some offices fantastic, others you think, you know, but you become rather